Welcome, Heather, to the Soul Aligned Self Care Podcast. Thanks for coming on today and joining me.
Thank you, Tina. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited about our conversation today because I remember now that I talked to you that what we talked about, like when I talked to you about coming onto the podcast, was a very exciting topic to me. But before we get into that, I would just like you to introduce yourself to, the listeners and maybe about what you do in this world, and then also a little bit about your journey and how you ended up doing what you do now.
Absolutely. Thank you. So my name's Heather Warren, and I'm a personal growth coach based in Ontario in Canada. And I particularly work with women who have gone through sweet hell with relationships. That can be with their family, that can be with their love, that can be with workplace. So it's really being able to actually recover and bloom a life they love. So a lot of it is about coming back to themselves and doing the inner work
Mhm.
and looking at their beliefs and self-love. And I call it unknotting your patterns. Um, so my specialty or my area of real uniqueness or interest would be in working with the ancestral and family patterns, because there's so much richness in our family of origin, but also where we've come from, whether
Mhm.
it is from place, people, dynamics, all of it, it has the impact of history and how it's impacting us now.
Mhm.
And I love working with it simply because it's so grounding. I do have a background as a medium and an intuitive reader and an energy healer, but I always love working with this realm because it feels very, it's not only practical, but everybody has a family.
Mhm.
Everybody
Yeah.
has ancestors. We're walking with, whether it is in our body, we're walking with them, or in our mind, or the stories. And there's something powerful that when we tune into that realm, um, there's meaning that comes forward. So when we're looking for purpose, or we're looking for support, or we're looking for belonging, if we start there and see where is the hole in my heart, or why are things just not feeling balanced, it's usually
Mhm.
a disconnect or there's something we're not seeing. And then it almost like when we look at it, and I call it sweet ahas, when we have those
Mhm.
insights that are like, oh my gosh, that breakthrough. It's
Mhm.
like you almost don't even need to process it, you just see it so clearly for what it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Then you're able to make decisions and move forward from a really grounded place. So I love working with that realm because it's like I love the angels and I love the ancestors. And I think
Mhm.
working with both the spiritual dimension on this level and the rootedness, it helps us find balance and
Mhm.
gives us a feeling of realness and love. And then we don't have to play out the patterns of our
Mhm.
parents. We don't have to play the
Yes.
patterns of our ancestors. So that's essentially sort of where I love going with clients, but ultimately I call it find a solution. So we all, part of the journey of recovery and resilience is being able to empower yourself to actually find, real solutions for your life, because you're walking in it different than somebody else.
Mhm.
And you ultimately know yourself best. But it's about coming back in and having somebody feel so you're heard, supported, understood.
Mhm.
You can find the clarity you need, and you're feeling, kind of for the first time working out, listening to that inner voice and listening to your heart. So, how, I don't want to talk on and on, but I know you asked me about how I got into this briefly.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you end up doing this work? Where did you have a different career beforehand and you moved into
Mm,
this?
Definitely a big story, but I would always describe it. I have a book called Being Weird, and it's about my
Hmm.
path as a medium. And I explain in there that I went on a spiritual journey to Mexico, in Oaxaca City, Mexico. And anybody and many people will understand, Mexico understands the realm of the ancestors. They do Day of the Dead festivals, and
Hmm.
especially in Oaxaca. And it was there that I went, oh, I haven't been looking at my ancestors.
Yeah.
I haven't been, and it was sort of, and it's very much from, in Canada, we're not, especially as a white Canadian, we don't talk about that. It's a more of an Indigenous perspective. Um, and all of a sudden, when I opened up to this idea that like my lifetime is small, and yet I come from people, like there's something that my people, or where I come from, my roots, have been trying to figure out. right? There was a reason why I was a traveler. There's a reason why I was drawn to going to a foreign country, like all of these things. So I realized by disconnecting, and I also will share the journey that I was a little bit of the odd, I don't want to call it the black sheep because I don't like the terms that term, but I would describe
Yeah.
it as not even the scapegoat, but just I felt like I disconnected from my family in order to have to heal myself.
Hmm.
And I didn't feel the need for family. I left home at 16. I felt like family was actually hurting me rather than helping me. So it was an important period where I went, oh, maybe I do need them. And I can't be so arrogant that I don't need them. They're human beings. And I was blocking my spiritual growth journey by judging them, right? Or
Wow.
by being afraid of them instead of actually growing up, right?
Hmm.
So I returned home. And when I returned home, as when in the spiritual journey, if you open up, you'll find your teachers. And so I ended up meeting right literally in my hometown a woman who was running Family Constellations workshops, which is all about family and ancestral patterns. And so I did
Wow.
2-year training and did a lot of delving. And I was like, what are the chances?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, so it all opened up from there, and ended up doing work with clients, running a business, doing intuitive readings and energy healing and family constellations workshops, and so here I am now.
Yeah, that's a beautiful journey. So explain before we get into it, explain what you mean by family constellations and,
Mhm.
what exactly does that mean?
Mhm. So it's considered to be another healing tool or modality, and the person who created it is named Bert Hellinger. He's passed away now, and he's in Germany, and he did a combination of work of being a psychotherapist. He went to he actually sat in with circles with Zulu shamans in Africa for a while. He was going there as a missionary, as a priest, and realized, oh, wait a minute, I don't know anything. I actually need to learn from the people. So good
Yeah.
thing he changed that. But his big mission was to help heal the generational trauma of post-war Germany,
Mm,
and which is where he was from, and to heal Holocaust survivors. Heal is, I don't even want to call it, but acknowledge and uh, try to move the systems forward of trauma
mhm,
between Nazi Germany and Holocaust survivors. So that was his big work. But he created this modality to understand about any on the planet. We have all generational trauma based on war, based on separation, movement. So it's this idea of he takes almost like psychotherapeutic principles, but puts a spiritual, energetic understanding of it.
mhm,
And there's something when you come into circle with people, it's like a sacred circle, and or even just one-on-one, tuning into your ancestors and intending. There's something really neat and powerful where all of a sudden the ancestors reveal to you what you need to know, and you may not, and you get humbled by it. You're like, oh, I thought it was this, but it's actually this.
mhm.
So some people will represent your ancestors if you're in a group setting. Some people will represent your ancestors and they energetically tune in. And it's so neat. If you ever are part of it or watch it, it's like something mystical happens. But when working one-on-one, I tend to work with objects. So we look at, you don't have to know anything about your ancestors. You don't have to know. In fact, the less you know is probably where the juice
Yeah.
is. So it's this idea that whatever is hidden is causing the problem. Whatever is in secret, whatever is in like the family doesn't talk about, that is
Yes.
where the healing happens.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's so what the family doesn't talk about. Like I have a story about that. But when you say ancestors, just to clarify, is this is there like a time period, or it can come from any time period? It can come from a long time
Yeah.
ago, or it can come from very recently. It can come
Ages
from both.
ago. Yeah, it can be both. Anyone who's passed
Yeah.
on to the other side, and that your family of origin is your doorway or gateway to your ancestors. So yeah,
Okay.
anybody who's gone into the realm of spirit.
Hmm.
And yes, and we can go back, like we've done constellations where you go back like 8, 10 generations.
Oh, so crazy.
Yeah, I could tell you story on story of how cool it is, down to and it doesn't even matter culturally, like it transcends culture, it transcends belief systems,
Yeah.
But and it's just the stories that come out of when you hear people, and they literally say if you do one constellation, it can last up to 2 years. Like all of a sudden it starts unfolding, and that definitely is the case.
Oh, it's
Um,
so interesting. When COVID came about, I swear to God, I went down so many different rabbit holes, like educational rabbit holes. And one of the things that I got really into was the genealogy of my family, and on my mother's
mm,
side and then my father's side. And my mother's side was easier to track because
mm.
we came over to the my mother's family came over to the United States in the 1900s, whereas my father's came over in the 1700s. It was harder to
Ah,
track because of the records, right? So I never
right.
really made the connection between Europe and when they
Hmm.
came over. But my mother's
Mm-hmm.
ancestors, it was so interesting. It was my great grandmother, and she came from Italy, and it was like a certain region which was very close to French. And then I learned that my um her father was French,
Wow.
and then they left Italy when, for lack of better words, when the shit was hitting the fan, it was right before Mussolini, I think. Um,
Oh, wow.
but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I just like looked at when they came over, and I looked at what was going on in history and what was going on in those small towns when
Mm-hmm.
it's like, why did they come here when they lived in beautiful Italy? And like,
Right,
so it's like
right,
I was like
right.
looking into those things. It was so interesting. But just to share of, what we don't talk about. So my that same great grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
they ended up in New York City like a lot of immigrants, and she was married. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was told, now, first of all, my great grandmother was a badass because she never, something happened with her husband. Um, she never remarried. She worked as a seamstress, and then she became a milliner, which is a hat
Oh,
designer in New
yes.
York City. She worked for one of the top designers in New York City, and she used to go to
Wow.
France and go to the racetracks and draw pictures of the fancy hats, and then come back to the United States. And this is
Oh
in
my
like the
gosh.
Depression era, like that time period. So I'm like, she was like a single like woman working in New York City. Like a, what a badass. And so like I always like I keep a picture of her. All right, everybody, this is
Oh,
Nunny. This is my
neat.
Nunny Vic. This is my Nunny. That's her
Oh,
sister.
there she. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. And what
Yeah.
time, what year would that have been photographed?
Oh God, this is probably, oh God, I don't even know when that was photographed, but I would bet she was in her 70s then. And I don't know. God, so long ago. I have no idea.
Wow. And
Um,
that's your great grandmother.
yeah, that's my great grandmother.
Great grandmother. Okay.
So yeah, her name was Victoria. We called her Nunny Vic because I think now I always thought when I was growing up her name was Nunny, but her name is not Nunny. That's like some kind of Italian, like Nona is Italian. So it
Right,
was something to do
right.
with that. So anyway, just like so her husband, I was told that he died of cancer. And so we have a lot of cancer in my family, but then I learned
Mm.
that he was just basically kind of like a shithead, and so it was
Oh.
easier to say that he died of cancer than to say what really happened. And I still don't know
Mm.
what really happened, but he did not die of cancer. So,
Okay. Okay. So you don't even know if he
um,
died. It could have just been they broke up or
yeah,
he left or
yeah. I think he
wow.
had a
Yeah.
problem with alcohol. And
Mm-hmm.
I think what
Mm-hmm.
happened was he lost his job during the Depression. And then I
Oh
think
yeah.
they had to move in with somebody. And then my grandmother was supporting the family. And I think that probably weighed heavy on him, making a lot of
Oh
assumptions
yeah.
here, a lot of
Yeah.
assumptions.
Yeah. But
But
you
that's what
can,
I
yeah.
tracked, like all the different records of where they lived and everything. It was like a
Yeah.
movie. It was so interesting. Um,
Wow.
so anyway,
Wow.
yes, the stories that we don't tell, I think hurt us because it would have been nice to know. It just is, it's a better, to me, it's a better story because I can see how empowered my great grandmother was at a time where women didn't really have any power, and
Yes.
instead of just thinking he
Yes.
died of cancer, no, she overcame something and she stepped into her power and
Mm-hmm.
she created
Mm-hmm.
this amazing foundation for our family. You know what I mean?
Totally.
So
Totally.
so like she raised my grandmother by herself, and then my mother and her two sisters used to go out to her house on Blue Point on Long Island and spend the summers there. And
Oh
then
my
she used to take them
gosh.
into the city to do fun stuff, you know? And so, like, what an amazing thing she created for herself. And it's such a better story. And I think knowing these stories are so important, you know, and
Yeah.
I wish
Yeah.
that I was a young, very young teenager when she passed, and she was in her 90s. I
Hmm.
wish that I knew these things beforehand. I learned all these things after she passed from my grandmother. I used to have these conversations with my grandmother. So I learned all about her working for this hat designer and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's
Yes.
so important to look at these things, but also what you're talking about, the healing.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
did she ever heal from this? Like she never remarried ever, you
Exactly.
know?
I was just gonna say, like,
Yeah.
there's, and even if I can just point out, I mean, I love, even as you're talking about, I can feel the pride, the strength, right? Like, this
Oh,
is a beautiful
I love
example,
it. Yeah.
right? And you probably draw on it whenever you're as an entrepreneur
That's
or
why her
you,
picture's on my desk.
yeah, like, you're my role model, like, this is
Yes.
amazing. Like, I can make it through
Yes.
too. And,
Yeah.
that's a beautiful example, and it's got chills. But just
Yeah.
the, like, no matter the hardships, you can draw on these ancestors that you really
Yeah.
identify with, connect with, admire, you see the fact you as her descendant sees her strength
Hmm.
strengthens her, and then she can strengthen you,
Yes. And
right?
that it
So it's so beautiful.
it wasn't looked at as strength back then in those days.
No,
This is stuff
no.
that you hide, and that's why it was hidden for so long. Like we're not going to talk
Right,
about what happened to Nani Beck
right.
because it's shameful for some way. And generations ago, so that's like one, two, three generations before me, Nani Beck. And so during that time period, it was shameful to get divorced. It was
Mm-hmm.
like being a single mother
Mm-hmm.
raising a child, it was probably hidden.
Oh
And then
yeah.
my grandmother was always resentful of her mother.
Oh
Even like I even
wow.
saw it like as a child,
Wow.
how resentful. And I'm like, maybe she was resentful because she didn't have a father, and maybe her mother was always working, or maybe she
Yeah.
was resentful because
Yeah.
she didn't have the same common acceptable by society life,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
instead of like embracing her strength and like championing
Mm-hmm.
her and supporting her, she was kind of like beaten down, and she
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
presented to me as a child how like she was nutty, like, and she
Mm,
always wore all this big jewelry. She was very like designery, like,
right.
and so like I never knew, like, I always thought of her as like this crazy grandmother, I never knew
Yeah.
how amazing she was. And so I
Right.
think it's
Right.
so important to like honor these women that
Completely.
came before us and went through all these things and were so suppressed and so um what's the
Yeah.
word, held back by society.
Stigmatized,
Yeah.
and yeah, the sexism, and
The
and I think
patriarchy.
it's actually, I was sharing this with my husband before, that I love this part, the suffragettes, which would have been the 20s and the 30s.
Yeah.
My gosh, like, I'm like, they were feminists before the word feminist came in. Like, they were
Hmm.
hardcore, like my grandmother as well, like
Yes.
diva, right? And I look at it and she's like, I'm like, it's this idea that when you're oppressed, you find coping mechanisms and you kind of have a wisdom of how to navigate it. And
Hmm.
it's the way that they held their beauty. Like Betty White is another example, right? The
Hmm.
actress, and the way that they held their strength, their wit, their beauty, their how they dealt with the male world and how the males treated them at the time,
Hmm.
how they dealt with societies. Like, it wasn't encouraged for a woman to be flashy or for a
Hmm.
woman to be noticed. There was so much sex shaming and all this stuff, right?
Hmm.
But they somehow, and it's like you can see it and go, my gosh, like, how did you rise above that? And there's a strength of not caring what other people think,
Yeah.
right? Like, there's such a soul strength. And I feel like that generation of women haven't been given the acknowledgement, or,
Not at all. Not at
oh,
all.
like, like we think that the feminist movement started in the 60s. I'm like,
No, no,
mm-mm,
no, no. I
mm-mm,
actually I found a suffragette on my father's side. in
Mhm.
that relation. I kind of like stopped digging on that side because I found some like unpleasantness that I didn't want to see. It wasn't as
Mhm.
romanticized as my mother's side.
Right,
And then I
right.
also struggled to make the connection to Europe, which was so frustrating because it
Mm,
just didn't have records from the boats that were coming over.
right.
But yeah, the one of the things, just bringing it back into like today's time
Mhm.
period, women in their 70s and 80s and even 90s that are still alive, like not being acknowledged at all for how powerful and important they are, and just being written off. I'm so tired
Yeah, yeah.
of older women being written off and feeling like they have no value when they hold more
Mm,
value and
mm,
more of the keys to our success as younger women, and the women and
mhm.
like my daughters, like they hold the keys to success. They had, so like I have a friend who's in her 70s. She was a part of the, the movement to protect abortion back in the day, right?
Yeah, wow,
They
wow,
had success with that, and
wow.
she even said to me, she's like, I don't have it in me to do that today. She's like, this is,
Mhm,
it's
mhm.
how disappointing it must be for all those powerful women, and even the women
Yes.
who were leaders back then, to see what's
Yeah,
happening right now. And
yeah.
but like I think it's a purposeful disconnection by society and the patriarchy,
Mhm,
because
mhm.
when we make those connections with these strong women who have the experience and the brains and the knowledge that we need to move us forward like faster, like
Yep,
expedited, um,
yep.
if we made that connection, and we're starting to make that connection, I've noticed that
Mhm, mhm.
we would have a whole lot more power. It's meant to keep us divided and powerless. We're
Yes,
going to look at
yes.
these women as powerless and not very useful, and they're just
Mhm,
silly old ladies,
mhm,
and we're not going to pay
mhm.
attention to them when it's just a wealth of knowledge. And I get so frustrated when I
Completely.
see it not being acknowledged. And so I feel like,
Yeah.
and when you talk about the healing of these women, the things that they went through,
Mhm.
they didn't heal. I don't think they
No,
spent
no, no. They didn't have time to
so
heal. They didn't have the resources. Totally.
they weren't allowed
No,
to. It wasn't
no,
acceptable, and
no.
so that must come up a lot when you're working with people, that you have all these old wounds, like, so to speak, like
Definitely.
my Nunny Vicks wounds, maybe passed on down the
Yes.
line.
Yeah.
So
And exactly, like, and I think that the piece around, it's understanding there's the piece around seeing their greatness and then also seeing their human vulnerability, and we carry that human vulnerability in ourselves.
mhm,
And being able to recognize, like, definitely, I have a grandmother who was in an unhappy marriage, but she was, top Avon sales lady. She was successful. You'd never guess it, right? She put on the happy face, but she would
mhm,
never. And it was all about, have to be in the joy. And she was embodied, like, she found her way through it. But this part around her ache was that she so badly wanted to be, she had a love of her life that she left. She married my grandfather for practical reasons,
mm,
like all these things, but in her heart, she was aching to meet the love of her life.
yeah,
And it was the, like, I can see how, it's like when she couldn't find her match, right? And then I had the same feeling. And, I fortunately kept doing my work and am in a happy marriage. And I feel like whenever I'm aware of that, I feel
mhm,
like I'm doing this for the women in my family. Like,
mhm,
this was the wound that wasn't acknowledged or healed, and we didn't see it as important. We go, oh well, that's just sort of men and women in marriages of the time. But I'm like, mm-mm. There were
mhm,
people, like, she so badly wanted to be in a loving relationship, but divorce wasn't okay. She would have lost everything. She would have been
yeah,
shamed, all these things if she actually followed
mhm,
her heart. So
yeah,
that would be, whenever I look at these things that she couldn't do, even though she was amazing, and then I go, I'm going to take it one step forward and do my work to make sure I'm going to learn from those lessons, right? And I'm going to take my
exactly.
freedom, that it's okay to break up with someone. It's okay to divorce. There's no shame in that. Go after love, right?
Mhm.
like there's no shame in being single, right? Like, there's no
Yes.
shame in just saying, I don't want to be in an unhappy marriage and I'd
Mhm.
rather be single, right? So
Yeah.
it's those pieces, it's as you're describing, it's the shame. The wounds come from disconnect, it comes from shame, it comes from lack of support, right? and
Yeah.
and the more that we can heal our own I'm going to say inner biases towards ourselves, or and we live in such a like there's it's so crazy. We live in such an open time and yet such a conservative time at the same
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I agree with that.
time.
It's going in two different directions. It's like tearing us apart. You have, and I agree, the part where like it's becoming more and more acceptable to be single,
Yes.
and but it's still very judged. Like, so I've been
Mm-hmm.
single by choice since 2020, and
Right. Yeah.
like as of now, I don't really have the intention to be in a relationship. Although I'm open to a relationship, it just has to be the right fit. I'm not going to settle. I'm not going to be in a relationship just to be in a relationship. And people have like a pity towards me because I'm an
Right.
old, yeah, it's
Right.
like an older woman. Oh, you'll find somebody. Don't you want somebody? And it's like, okay, like it has to be someone that's going to bring some kind of value into my life. I don't want to be someone's mom. I don't want to, you know, be like a maid. I don't want to be a sex object. I want to be a
Hmm.
partner. And until I
Yeah.
find that, I'm not going to be in a relationship because I don't need any extra work. Like I spent my life working my butt off with my kids. I don't need another kid to raise. And so it's like,
No.
that needs to change. And so like
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
respect everything that my kids want in their lives, whether they want to get married or
Right.
they don't want to get married, whether they want to have kids, they don't want to have kids. That's I'm not going to say
Yeah.
another word about it because that's their
Yeah.
choice and it'll turn into whatever it's supposed to turn into. And I'm not going to be that person that doesn't support everything that they desire in their life.
Yeah.
Anything
Yeah.
is acceptable, and no
Yeah.
judgment because I feel like we need to start letting go of that judgment and just let women be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
They'll do their thing. Like we're
yeah,
fine. Like we just don't bother. Don't like
yeah,
attack us, hurt us, judge us. It's like
yeah,
we'll figure our way.
yeah. And it's just
I
it's
know.
so interesting, and I wonder like the effect that my marriage had on my kids and how that's going to affect them moving forward. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
like at this point, I can only be what I could be now. I can't control anything that happened in the past. And,
Right.
so I
Yeah.
just hope that, I always talk openly about it with them and apologize for anything that I feel like was wrong, acknowledge, which is very important,
Mm-hmm.
acknowledgement
Mm-hmm.
of the things that they felt or might have felt that I didn't, pay attention to or didn't notice. Because I feel like the generations before me, like my mother, my grandmother, and my great grandmother, the ones that I know of, I don't know of the other ones, right?
Yeah.
Everything was hidden. Nothing was
Exactly.
talked about.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it was,
Right.
I remember when I had it was my second miscarriage, right? In between my
Yeah.
oldest daughter and my middle child, I had two miscarriages. It's my second miscarriage. And it was very upsetting because it was like right at that safety mark where you're like, oh, everything's good now.
Mm-hmm.
Everything,
Mm-hmm.
nothing's
Right.
going to happen past
Right.
this point.
Oh, that's
And
heartbreaking.
I was going, yeah. And so I went in, and there was no heartbeat. And so my mother came with me to the appointment. And that's when we found out that there was no baby anymore. And I was so devastated because I did
Wow.
not expect it. I did not
No.
expect it. She
No.
wouldn't she wouldn't talk about it on the way home. She was like, we're just going to change the subject. She wouldn't even acknowledge it. It was the first time I experienced that with my mother. Now, my mother was very
Wow.
loving, very
Wow.
caring person. Like
Wow.
every time I saw her and left her, it was like, I love you, hugs. Like
Right.
my mother's
Right.
super warm. So that was just super cold, but that was how she was raised to deal with that
Mm-hmm.
something traumatizing like that. That's how it was
Mm-hmm.
handled in her house, and that's how she was going to
Mm-hmm.
handle it. And I was just like,
Oh my gosh, and that's such a beautiful example of where a secret lives, right? Like
yeah,
that would be the piece where we go, okay, what other women had abortions,
yeah,
miscarriages, deaths of
yeah,
children that we don't want to look at it because if we look at it, we have to grieve, right?
yeah,
If we look at it, we have to feel the pain and that'll
hmm,
debilitate us, right? Like,
yeah,
and so much we live in that culture where it's like we're not going to look at death, and we're not going to look
hmm,
at what seems to be too painful, and yet when we avoid it, it
yeah,
blocks love, right? It
yeah,
blocks the connection. It actually blocks the honoring of that child that didn't come to term, right?
exactly.
This is where the disconnects and when we're working with that realm of life and death, it's like when we can actually just go, I see you, and
Mm-hmm.
I see that you couldn't be with us, but you're
Mm-hmm.
still my child. I still love you.
Yeah.
And like that's the pain that has to be healed in the lineage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it would be so, the fact that that's how your mom responded. We don't know your mom's journey, we don't know her
Yeah.
grandmother's, like all these things. It's, that would be another clue.
Mm-hmm.
And even the piece when you're speaking about being single and stuff too, is when you're talking about that great grandmother, who this guy, he obviously, something happened. Like this guy could
Yes.
have taken off and left her for a younger woman or whatever. We don't know
Whatever. Yeah.
what happened,
We'll
right?
never know.
But the singlehood, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so it's interesting how you ended up, like, you have a very similar,
Yes.
the why you were drawn to her, probably a similar journey in some way, shape, or form. I don't know. Obviously, we don't get into your past relationship with the
Yeah.
father of your children, but you could probably find some mirrors, or you could probably find some clues as to who that great grandfather was, right?
Yeah.
And then being able to, and at the same time, we say we also honor the assholes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like my dad was a total jerk, like
Yeah.
total jerk, and I wanted nothing to do with him, and it
Mm-hmm.
kept knocking on my door. And it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't until I could actually see him as a human being and go, oh, toxic masculinity, he's suffering too.
Yeah.
There's, like all of those things. I didn't have to attract people in my
Mm-hmm.
life. I would attract men that weren't the right fit, that turn into crazy narcissistic abusers, and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
it's my father. It's this idea you keep attracting your father until you get the lesson, right?
Yeah.
So,
Thank you so
so,
much. Yeah.
right. So it would be an interesting meditation with your great grandmother, even you could do on your own time, but to meditate, imagine if this man who was the father of her child, one child, did she just have one child?
One. Yeah. A daughter.
One. Okay, so
Yeah.
now that even gives me some clues, even what you're sharing. That would have been very rare to just have one child in that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
That's true.
and I don't know, did they meet in New York or did they meet in Italy?
Um, no, they met in New York. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, we don't even know if she was the other woman, or we don't
Mm-hmm.
even know if she was, like having
Yeah.
one child at the time would have been like my great grandmother had a child out of wedlock. So she
Mm-hmm.
was seen as the bastard child, and she didn't have siblings and stuff. So my great grandmother just had one child, and she was the other woman. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So she didn't have, my great grandmother didn't know her father, all these things. But if you could actually meditate on seeing them together, that even for a moment in time, they were attracted to each other.
Yeah.
Even for a moment of time, there was lust or passion. And I don't know if it was if you know how long they were together for. Again, there could have been violations. There could have been, it wasn't a positive experience, but to go,
Mm-hmm.
these are the two people that brought forward your lineage,
Yeah.
and how we can include this man to go, okay, for whatever social reasons, he didn't stick around,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or for whatever life reasons, he didn't stick around. And in a weird way, because he didn't stick around, your grandmother became great.
Yeah.
Your great
Mm-hmm.
grandmother became great, right? Like it was the struggle of being the single woman in
Mm-hmm.
that she's like, damn it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go, like, and she was probably great when he met her, and that idea that she had to carry the weight, like,
Yeah.
but because he was weak, or because he was, and this isn't to justify codependency, but because of that, she actually became even greater in your
Yeah.
family system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of have to honor him to go, okay, well, you showed it that women, because of you, women, we figured out that women can do it on their own.
Yeah.
Right?
That's true. That's really true.
Right?
She had to do it, but she could have went in a whole different direction. She didn't
Yeah.
have to do it because
Mm-mm.
it would have been accepted in society at that point for her to fail, you know?
Right?
And
Yeah.
so, but
Yeah.
she decided that that wasn't going to happen. And she created this wonderful life for herself. And I always like, they were married, I know, but I'm sure I have a record of it, but I don't know how long they were married for because there's no
Mm.
record of the ending. Like, I don't
Right.
know if there was a
Right.
divorce because it was just kept quiet. And my dad is
Wow.
still alive, but he doesn't remember. Like, it was just, I don't think they were
Mm-hmm.
together that long. I really think that and I always think of him as feeling so, um, just like torn down because he couldn't support his family that
Right.
he was just,
Right.
he turned to alcohol,
Yeah, which is so common back
Yeah.
then. Like even doing
Yeah.
AA, like
Hmm.
AA started around the turn of the century before prohibition, and like so men with alcohol, it was seen as normal and social, right up
Hmm.
until the 80s and
Yeah.
the 90s, and it was how a lot of men fell, right?
Hmm.
And what's interesting is being able to. There's something else I was going to add with that. And definitely we have to look at her personality strength, and chances are that's what he was attracted to,
Hmm.
right? So even
That's
if you were to
true.
look at a potential partner, you want somebody who sees your strength, your everything you've overcome, for
Yeah.
example, right? To
Yeah.
go, oh, and that and then the next level is that he doesn't have substance use issues or whatever, like he's a healthier, he takes care of his health, right? Which is
Yeah.
the work you're doing, right?
Hmm.
So, but it's like it is possible to find a male who likes a strong woman, right? To
Hmm.
actually see that possibility, and that the strength isn't a negative, right? Like
Yeah.
it's actually it's what the attractive feature is,
Yeah.
because she probably had that in her.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember her being quite spicy. So like I remember when I was like 8, 9, or 10, like that age, and she would come over to the house, and she was an old lady back then, and she was so typically Italian, like she had the sweater on with the tissue up her sleeve and just like all those little things that your grandmother does, but she was not like she was funny. Like she used to like ask me to pull the hairs out of her chin, and she would pay me 25 cents for each hair. Like I swear to God, I was like 9 years old, and I'm like, and I'm just like, give me more money, like
Oh my gosh,
how
this sounds like my grandmother.
oh, she was hilarious. I thought she was a riot. And she used to
Mm-hmm.
wear like the jewelry she would wear was like, and I have some of that
Mm-hmm.
jewelry now, and it's just really cool.
Mm-hmm.
But it
Mm-hmm.
is, it is, I could see, I really embraced that when I went into the genealogy. Just really
Yeah.
like, and I'm sure some of these stories that I have in my head, like that helped me connect the dots, aren't all
Mm-hmm.
correct. I know that
Of
that's
course.
probably,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
knows what the real
Mm-hmm.
story is, but you can see like the overlying thing that happened that wasn't healed. Like, so now her daughter, my grandmother, she married the love of her life and was very happy, right? And
Mm-hmm.
she
Mm-hmm.
had 3 kids, but she didn't want to have 3 kids because they had three
Oh.
kids to keep him out of the Korean War, I believe it was.
Oh, wow.
Because if you had
Okay.
three, I think three was the number. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and so she had 3 girls, and they um they were not treated well. I think she
Mm.
resented them, like
The
I feel like,
grandmother.
yeah, I
Yeah.
feel like she loved them, but she was very cold. Even like she was just a very
Mm.
cold person. And so maybe
Mm-hmm.
she never wanted to have, like, my thought was maybe she never wanted to have kids because she didn't have a good experience
Yeah.
as a kid, growing
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
And so my mother and her sisters grew up like they cleaned the house, they made their own clothes. At Christmas time, they would get
Wow.
like one present that they had to share. But meanwhile, like her parents would buy all these extravagant gifts for their friends to make them like look good,
Wow.
like stuff like
Wow.
that,
Like
just like,
serious neglect and
yeah. And
yeah.
just like,
Yeah.
so then when my mother, it was so important for my mother to be a good mother. She was like over the top. Like my mom
Right.
was like, I
Right.
won the lottery with my mom. Like
Mm.
she did everything. Like she
Mm.
made my clothes when I was little. She cooked and baked and threw these big birthday parties for
Wow.
us. And Christmas was like ridiculous. Everything was ridiculous over the top.
Right.
And she was the same way
Right.
with my children. Like she was the same way. And so
Yeah.
like because it was
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
important to her. So you could see like generally the different
Mm-hmm.
differences in the wounds and how
Mm-hmm.
they reacted from
Exactly.
those wounds. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's just really interesting. So I can see the power of the work that you do, but I'm kind of
Mm-hmm.
interested because you go back even further sometimes. So how does that
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
come up? How does
Mm-hmm.
that come up for you?
Mm. Well, it's interesting because again, I would say when I'm working one-on-one online, we use objects. So it all depends on how, like, I can see if an issue is close
Hmm.
to the person's family system. Like, it depends on where they're placing the objects and so forth. So I will look at the patterns of what they're showing and find the meaning in it. And then if we see that it's really far away, I start delving into, tell me about your ancestral story and what happened. And then we hear about the Korean War. We hear about
Yeah.
the, we hear all these things and we go, oh, like I went back to generations with somebody where, she has way back when connection to India, but it's like generations, like way back.
Wow.
And they had migrated, but she does not like such spicy food. She does, and it's not because of just being Canadian, like growing up in Canada. Like she was fine with multicultural food. She was fine with her family would have spicy foods, but she had such a deep aversion to it. And
Yeah.
it was an interesting thing where I'm like, let's go far back to
Yeah.
India, or going into like what are the migration patterns and where's the pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So things that feel not integrated, or we start first with the person and what their issue is. Like it
Mm-hmm.
would just be like, okay, like if you were to say, I really want to find a relation, like if that was the case, right? If, again, I don't say you have to be in anything, but if the
Mm-hmm.
person was coming and saying, look, I'm ready to find a new relationship, but I'm terrified. I don't want it to be like my ex. I don't want it to be drama. I don't want to. And
Yeah.
then we start looking at, okay, we start going into, tell me, like, what does that look like? And then if there's a missing, like if the person's like, yeah, I don't want a male close to me right now. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, let's take a look to see does that come from your mother, your grandmother? How far back does this go? And it's pretty phenomenal. It's hard to describe it from, like, each person is different, but
Mm-hmm.
we usually start first with the family of origin. And as we keep unpacking it, we start going further back.
Yeah.
And it's not just through conversation, like we actually tune into the body. How are you feeling? What's coming up
Mm-hmm.
for you mentally and emotionally? Because you literally, every person, I swear, we walk with our ancestors
Oh,
mentally,
absolutely.
spiritually, physically, right? So
Mm-hmm.
as a facilitator, I'm here to really deeply listen to, like, what's coming up for you, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is true for you? What are you sensing? What are you feeling? And then I can point out, did you see it this way? Or what about this? Right. And because the idea that we will only see what we want to see, and we will only see what our mind can handle and what our
Yes.
ancestors can handle. And again, like I can see something and you're like, no, I'm not seeing it. It's like, okay, it's not meant to be seen yet.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's actually quite a benevolent process, because it doesn't try to say, all of a sudden I had somebody who was ready for it. She was ready to see that she had, a Nazi Germany grandfather. Right.
Wow.
And she was like, oh my God, this makes me ill. But she was ready for it. Right. She had the inner strength. She had the capacity. She's like, okay, I have to see how this affects my life journey. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing this and how I relate with my family.
Yeah.
Right. Um, so things that get revealed it's really in its own timing. And we do focus on what is the issue, and then how do we unpack it from there.
Yeah.
Um, but I wanted to add something in about the situation with your great grandfather. The other part is, I wanted to ask, have you looked for a death certificate for that great grandfather?
No, I didn't look for that. I did
Okay.
not. That would be
So that might be
interesting to do.
something, yeah, to see if
Yeah.
that might be a clue.
Yeah.
Um, so then you can get a sense of the timeline.
Yeah. That would be. I never looked for the death certificate because I was just told that he died, but it would be
Mm-hmm.
curious to see, if he lived like way past from what I was told when he died. So that
Yeah.
would be, yeah, that's a good point. I'll have to do that. I'll have to dig into that.
Mm-hmm.
I was
Mm-hmm.
very lucky with all the records from my family, and a lot of it came from the records, what are they called? Oh my God, I'm just blanking out right now, where they tell you where you lived on the different times and years,
Yeah.
just very accurate, and all the people in the house, and it was just so accurate. And so I really lucked out with that side of my family. And yeah, on my father's side, it was like leading, like his family, it was going down a path that I didn't really want to go down. So I was like, yeah, I
Right.
think, like you said, yeah, I don't want to know that, kind of. But it was like,
Yeah.
I think they
Mm-hmm.
were like slave owners and stuff like that. And I was
Right.
like, oh God, this is horrible. Like,
Yeah.
so I just didn't even want to
Yeah.
go there. And they were just like, um
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
very, like, it was very confusing because, like, I think it was like the great great grandfather was married and had like a million kids, and then had another person over here and had a million kids
Mm-hmm.
with her, and then and I was like, oh my God, what's happening here? Like I was just like, I could be related to
Yeah,
anyone walking down the street.
totally.
And so
Totally.
I was just
Totally.
like, I was
I'm
like,
gonna
this
get a
is
DNA on every person I date.
yeah. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm just gonna stop. And I was like, I'll just focus on the relatives that came from Europe. And then I couldn't make the connection. So I just stopped. And so I was like, okay. But
Well, I'm
yeah.
so curious because it feels like from like if I were to work with you, I would definitely want to work with your father's end because that's the hidden end, right? Your
Yeah.
father's side of it. And especially if you wanted to
So
look at some of these patterns around the women in your family and how they were treated and so forth,
mhm.
there's the juice is over there, which is exactly where it was for me. And
Yeah.
we're subconsciously playing it out even when we're not looking at it, right?
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating because same thing. I've had on my one side of the family, they were shipbuilders, but
Mhm.
some of them were emancipators, slave emancipators, and others, I'm sure, must have been part of the slave trade. Just
Yeah.
from being shipbuilders and all of this. So
Mhm.
it was the time period, and a lot of people who were in North America, or white people and European descent, and all of that were
Mhm.
connected, right, to this in some way. And it's like one of those things that, again, if we don't look at it, then it's sort of like, what's the lesson, right? Like, what do I
Yeah.
need to learn? And whether it is that I advocate for stopping human trafficking in this lifetime, or it can be actually part of a meaningful cause, or it can strengthen us in
Interesting.
making
Yeah.
sure those injustices don't keep continuing, or we get, not that you have to make up for that ancestor, but you go, let's make sure it doesn't happen again,
Yeah.
right? And how can I be a vehicle for change in a positive way, or in a humane way, moving, and especially as healers, that's kind of our calling. There's a reason why
Mhm.
you've chosen to be a healer, right?
Mhm.
And it's usually because of the pain of abuse of power, or stress, or a oppressive world. And so it could actually be connected to one of your greatest strengths as a healer,
Yeah, that's so
if you
interesting. I
take
never
a look
thought
at
of
it.
it that way.
Yeah,
That's
it's
just
yeah.
that's very interesting. That's like such a
Hmm.
good point. Oh my goodness.
Hmm.
Well, I could talk about this
I know this is
absolutely forever.
I know.
I could
It's
really,
such rich, right? It's so rich.
yeah, it's so interesting because you could just see the patterns playing out. But even when it's right in front of you, like
Hmm.
all the work that I did, even when it's right in front of you, you don't
Hmm.
always know what it means. And it's always,
Hmm. Hmm.
and like you said, it's like inside of me knows, but it
Hmm.
needs to be facilitated and supported by
Yes.
someone like guided. And
Hmm.
that's what you're here for. And so,
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah. That's
yeah,
my
and
job.
I think that's a very cool job, first of all. But so how can people connect with
Mhm.
you? How could
Mhm.
they learn more about what you
Absolutely.
do?
Yep. So you can check out, my website is www.csoul. So it stands for confident soul, but csoul.ca.
Mhm.
Also, I have a Facebook group called She Blooms, a women's soul sanctuary.
Oh, cool.
So that one, I just post daily posts of the path of resilience, and
Mhm.
sharing about whether it is talking about your lineage, or woo woo Wednesday is what I call it. I do videos.
Nice.
Um, and I'm also going to be starting a once a month group called Not the Pattern,
Mhm.
soul spa. So it's really being able to take a look at a pattern, and it's if you're part of the Facebook group, you'll be able to get the event notices.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice.
So, and I
That
also
sounds
have
very cool.
an ebook on my website, Ask Your Heart ebook of journal prompts. So if you're trying to figure out and sort out
Oh,
your heart, and you're wanting to tune in, it just gives some nice journal prompts on there.
oh, that's nice. All right, all those links will be in the show notes. Um,
Awesome.
Once again, I want to thank you for coming on. I feel like we could continue this conversation and go even deeper. So maybe I'll have you on again at some point because I think it would be
Definitely.
so much fun just to keep going. We only like kind of touched, we just
Hmm.
kind of touched it a little bit. So um, thank you for your knowledge. Thank you. I've never knew
Yeah.
like anything like this existed. So it's just
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
And so thank you for the work that you do in the world. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you.
Thanks for being open, and thank you for sharing your journey too. I'm so grateful to be able to do that.
Yes.